Sense podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 7th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of July 12th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I am excited. Here we are now getting into like midsummer, really getting into this season after Pentecost, as we've talked about many times before, this growing season, this time where we just keep focusing in on how does our faith continue to grow. And this week in particular, I think it's a very familiar parable we'll be talking about, but I think it also encourages us to make sure that we aren't going necessarily just surface level, that we are going deep. And sometimes that deep roots that we need to be able to develop means that we have to think critically and think for the long term. And I think it's something as humans, sometimes we really struggle with. We wrestle with that idea, but I think it's something that's vital for us to be able to really move forward with. So before we get into that whole conversation, before we get there, let's look back to last week's question, which was, how are you going to unite people instead of divide people? And how are you going to handle that emotionally well? And I found a really interesting comment this last week that we got back, was talking about when we're listening, when we're taking in information, when we're thinking about these things, we need to be looking at them not just with our ears and hearing what they're saying, but we also need to be listening with our eyes. And this was a great discussion and conversation about how communication is not just the simple thing of listening. You can listen to this podcast straight, no problem. But where we really communicate is being able to have these interactions back and forth, having communication and listening to what I'm saying and then responding back. Or when we're in person, looking at also body language in and of itself helps paint the picture of what is going on, helps paint the picture of how we are understanding this, and in doing that, be able to draw us closer together, be able to better understand, and in doing that, it helps all of us do better. And that's a vital thing and a very important thing for all of us to be remembering and to do. If we're all doing better, then we're able to spread the gospel better. We're better able to communicate with each other. We're better able to hear and understand what each of us is doing. And in doing that, that brings us closer together. And thus, a lot of these divisions that we have break apart. And I think, and especially in the world in which we're in, and heck, just human nature, the more walls that we can break down, the more things that bring us closer together, the better off we're going to be in the long term. And so I think it's vital for us to be looking at these types of things, thinking about these types of things, to be able to help guide us and steer us and direct us toward where we're needing to go with these types of conversations. So let's just jump into it this week. One of the Old Testament texts you can have is from Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 34. And I want to argue this is a kind of familiar text here. It's where we get this beginning of Isaac's has Rebecca and they get married, and we've talked about that last week. And now it's the aspect that within her womb, she is having twins. She is having Esau and she is having Jacob. And they are two fighting nations as we get within verse 23. And as they grow older, there is favoritism. Jacob admires Esau because he's more of the outdoorsman, more of the hunter, more of the goes and gets things done that way, where Jacob is more with his mother, helping in the tent, that type of thing. Jacob is making stew the one day, and technically Esau came out first, and Esau is famished. He says he's near death, basically. And Jacob is saying, before I give you food, sell me your birthright. And Esau responds with, I'm about to die. What use is a birthright to me? And so he swears off the birthright. He gives him some lentil soup and bread. He drinks it, and he quickly goes away, having given up his birthright. The psalm that then goes with that is Psalm 119, starting at verse 105 to 112. And the first line of this, I feel, is a very familiar verse. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. This recognition on how when things have come up in my life that God continues to provide, God continues to give in abundance. And even as things are looking like they are going to destroy me, God continues to step in and help and brings joy and helps bring the best out of these situations. The other Old Testament text this week is out of Isaiah chapter 55, starting at verse 10 to 13. And this then is talking about this aspect of looking at rain in the fields. And it's kind of giving this as a metaphor. Rain and snow come down from heaven and does not return, but until it has watered the earth to bring forth sprout and giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater. And this kind of ties in a little bit that way. But it's this idea on how when God is providing, when God is giving something, it is going to nourish everything around us. And so it's this recognition on how in doing that, then there is peace, there is joy, there is this rejoicing that has happened because we're recognizing how God is providing, and thus in doing that, we are able to flourish out of that. This continues then when we jump into the psalm for that text, which is Psalm 65, optionally 1 through 8, but then 9 through 13. And it's this recognition on, again, that God doesn't look at all our transgressions, all our things and where we've fallen short. God continues to show how he gives in abundance. God waters the earth and then gives forth this abundance for us to be able to be part of. And so in that, there is this growing, this bounty, this rejoicing that comes out of this because of look what all has been given. And thus we should be able to rejoice and be part of that and look at the amazing things of what is going on because of all of this. The second reading or epistle text this week then is out of Romans chapter 8, starting at verse 1 to 11. And this then kind of continues in this debacle that we've kind of been getting out of Romans the last few weeks. The spirit of the law versus the spirit within us, and what this fight that goes back and forth, and how when we are being spirit-minded and following where Christ is going, it's this recognition that the flesh will die, but that's not what is important. That the spirit dwells within us continues on. And thus, this is what needs to be fed and nourished. This is the thing that needs to continue to grow. And the flesh falls away. But as long as we are continuing to seek after the spiritual food that we're needing, we'll continue to grow. And so this recognition on that the human flesh may fall away, the things of this world may fall away, but what we're striving after is what is something that is going to continue to provide long beyond after our bodies are still here. The gospel text then this week is out of Matthew, the first 9 verses of it, and then continuing in 18 to 23. We're jumping in here where Jesus has a large crowd of people and ends up going out on a boat and is giving many parables. And one of them then is the sower and the seed, in that we have the seed that gets cast out, and some of it falls upon the path and the birds eat it up. Some of it falls on rocky ground where there isn't much soil. They spring up, but there's no depth. So the sun rises and they scorch them out and they wither away. Other seeds are growing up within the thorns and get choked out, and thus they don't survive. And then some fall in the good soil and thus provides 100-fold, 60-fold, or even 30-fold. And then we jump ahead in the text, and this is where then after Jesus has given other parables, he's walking with his disciples. They're asking, what does this all mean? And he then provides some insight into that. Anyone who hears the word from the kingdom and does not understand it, and the evil one snatches it away, is like the ones who fall in the path. As for the rocky ground, it's one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, but yet such a person has no root for it. And so thus when trouble or persecution arises, that person immediately falls away. For the ones among the thorns, they hear the word, but the cares of this age, the lure of wealth, choke out the word, and it yields nothing. And those for the good soil, it's the one who hears the word, understands it, and indeed bears fruit, and it yields 100-fold and 60-fold and 30-fold based off of that yield. The idea of the word coming in and really meaning something and really embedding themselves within, and thus being able to see that fruit come out of that. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to be thinking about and contemplating these texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but they also have prayers, hymns, colors, daily readings to get you into these texts, but along with also they've been redoing their art section. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, it's a great resource, and I highly recommend checking that out as well. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with other resources, more environmental topics, talking about how we bring that into your weekly lectionary text. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast for half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. That'll be the first link down in the show notes. Finally, I also highly recommend checking out Esau Nadali Teddy's Beyond the Argument Where Science and Scripture Meet. That'll be the second link down in the references section. It's a great short paper going through and talking about at a high level how science and faith work together instead of in opposition. If you have any people that are wrestling with this or enjoy just reading about something that's not necessarily super scientific dense, this is a great article to be able to go through that and kind of show how these work hand in hand. So I'd highly recommend checking out Beyond the Argument Where Science and Scripture Meet. Make sure to check that second link down in the show notes in the references section out. It is worth the read. What do we recognize with these texts this week? When Jesus is talking about like the sower and the seed, when we get like Esau and Jacob, when we get talking about the battles within our own flesh, we have to recognize a couple things. First, we struggle to recognize the long-term vision on where we need to be going. And when we do, we then start recognizing, bringing in the other texts coming out of Isaiah this week, but we see it also in the Psalms, the abundance that comes with that. When we actually obey what God is wanting us to do, it's amazing. It's almost as if God wants to bless us. And in doing that, then it becomes easier for us to obey, listen, and do the things where God is calling us to be. It is easier for us to become the seeds that is bearing 100 or 60 or 30 fold, and to not be choked out by lures of our current time of what we're in, making sure that we're not necessarily just springing up and really excited and losing passion. And then also making sure that we're conscientious to make sure that other people aren't just being picked up off the path, that we're walking alongside them and caring about them because we're noticing and communicating with them. I would argue that it's easy for us to get really caught up in this type of conversation and just think about it from a faith lens. And thus, this is why I would argue, this is why part of why this podcast is so important. We need to be able to bring our faith outside of that box. We need to make sure that our faith is influencing how we are interacting with all facets of our life. And I would argue, I think a really good one for us to be thinking about and evaluating is the environmental crisis with this. We see and we have heard for decades that we are influencing things in the climate, and thus there's plenty of people who don't want to hear it. Well, let's make sure we have some fundamental framework here on what we're working with. 2025 was the third warmest year on our world global records since 1850, taking in the whole globe. And you say, okay, that doesn't sound that bad. Third warmest, still warm, but not great, but it could be worse, right? The issue is the top 10, so we're taking 1850, the top 10 have all been the last 10 years. All have occurred since 2015. This is difficult. And when we look at also how this influences like major hurricanes, we had 3 storms that got to category 5 strength, which is extremely high, the second highest count on record that we've ever gotten that in 2025. We're looking at that our parts per million of CO2 is beyond 430 for the first time in 2025. These are all hard things, and we've been hearing about this stuff all creeping up for decades. And yet it's difficult for us to acknowledge all of this. It's hard for us to acknowledge this because it means we need to adapt, we need to change, we need to do things differently. Now, to give you a little bit of good news, we have increased solar generation and had the largest ever electricity generation by solar in 1 year. And in fact, in the EU, solar and wind together surpassed fossil fuels' share of electricity generation for the first time in 2025. But in order for us to do these types of things, we have to have a long-term focus and realize that it's beyond right now. It's that we're looking to the future and what is that going to bring. And I think that's where sometimes we fall apart a little bit. We see this even in technology. It's really odd. Green technology or renewable technology, the uptake of that as a general person is behind almost any other thing that we do. Looking at like other technologies, especially we are in this technological age, we uptake that stuff so much faster than we do anything on the renewable front. And some of this is socioeconomic. Some of it is based off of psychology drivers of how we're going to be looked at as a community, social influences, political influences on whether or not they are able to give some monetary offset, because some of this can be some big upfront costs. How are people going to perceive me? And there's a lot of perceived risk in doing it because it's a change in how we're doing things. It's a change in how we're looking at things. And in that, it causes us to be short-sighted. We see the risk of that. We see how much this is going to change my life and how I'm going to have to adapt that. Well, it's just easier for me to continue doing what I'm accustomed to. It's easier to stay with the path that's well worn. It's easier for me to do that. And thus, we fall short. We don't uptake this stuff. We start finding excuses. We figure out, well, this is something that needs to be happening at a broader scale instead of recognizing that it can also happen as a grassroots movement to influence bigger things to change and adapt. Esau and Jacob, I think, is a really interesting story that we have this week. Jacob is looking and seeing an opportunity to really grab hold of something and change his whole outlook. And Esau can't see beyond the meal that he is at and the need that he is seeing at this current moment. This great hunter-gatherer, we would assume, has not prepared for what is coming, and thus ends up having to give up something that is extremely valuable and loses sight of how valuable it is. We have in Paul's text talking about making sure we are spiritually being continually fed, continually growing, continually making sure that we are deepening our roots, which plays into the gospel text really well. That we need to make sure that we are continuing to figure out ways to deepen our faith. Sometimes that may mean doing something that appears to be a risk. Sometimes that appears to making sure that we're not falling into other societal norms that are potentially taking us away from what could be a great joy that comes later, the abundance that can come later. I personally, at my place, do not have solar. My parents have solar. And I've watched how that has transformed how they look at their energy bill. I've watched how my dad going out in the winter to scrape his solar panels just to try to get a little bit more energy. One, he's an accountant, so yes, he's getting more bang for his buck from the initial investment. But it's also in that same practice, it's getting him outside. He's enjoying the weather out there, but he's also connecting with his energy grid in a much different way and looks at it in a much different way because of that. And I've watched that and witnessed that as they've had it now for nearly 10 years. It's crazy to think about. It's been that long, but also how that's connected them in a different way to that. I've interacted with plenty of people who've gone to renewable energy vehicles or things of that nature. These things that we see as major obstacles, and even myself at times. Looking at some of the different trips that I do semi-regularly and just like, oh, that would be hard to navigate. And yet when you talk to them, it's like you just start to plan it and it just starts to fit into what you're doing. And then it doesn't become this big deal. It's that you're having to relearn how you're going to approach things. You're thinking about it just differently, and that becomes the new norm. For what was sown on the rocky ground is that the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet, such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. Does that not sound how sometimes we approach some of these energy needs that we're needing as a world? If I don't have the economic return, it's not worth it. If I don't get something back for me doing that, it's not worth it. I am not going to change the way that I do things because I don't see the benefit in doing that. The benefit may not be for us directly. The benefit may come 40 years later because our earth is doing better, that we all flourish from that. Too often we get consumed then purely about what is in it for me, that we lose sight of how is that going to impact all of us, myself included. I just did a major house project, and it's not necessarily going to go and benefit everybody. It's benefiting my wife and I and our future family. That's what it's benefiting. And yes, there's reasons for doing that, but also at what point do I start considering and thinking about how am I going to benefit others in what I am doing and not just be purely concerned about myself? Now, granted, there are other projects that we've done. We've done some pollinator gardens and things of that nature. There's certain things that we have done, and yes, over time, but I would also argue there's still more that I could do. And the more that I'm doing that and the more that I'm working on trying to impact more than just myself, is that not providing good soil so that the bounty, not only for myself, but for others, is abundant? Is that not what then helps all of us thrive, not just myself? That I'm not getting caught up purely with what is going to benefit me monetarily or what this world says is important, but I'm looking at how am I going to benefit others instead of just myself. That's the beauty and the crux to a lot of the green energy and renewable energy and just thinking more about a renewable planet. Is it's not about me. It's about all of us. And we have to think that way collectively. And especially being in a Western nation, especially being in the United States, that is not my typical go-to. My typical go-to is to think about me, myself, and I, and how is it going to benefit me, myself, and I, and those that I directly care about. It's not often that I sit down and think about how can my actions benefit the collective, all of us, the collective we. And I would argue what Christ is getting into with the parable here is that we need to be looking at that. And what we start seeing then out of like the Isaiah text is the aspect of look at the bounty that God wants to provide if we are listening. We start seeing how things are in circles. We start seeing the cycles that are naturally there that God is providing. We start seeing how God is wanting to provide this bounty so that all are well taken care of. That there isn't necessarily this huge divide, but it means all of us taking part in that, not just looking to certain people to take part. Is there a point where at times there might be different responsibilities that need to be given to certain people? Sure. But it also means that we all have a role to play in it for all of us to long-term benefit. And we have to be okay with that. We have to recognize that there might be certain people, myself included, where maybe I have a bigger responsibility, a bigger role to play to help in this, that I'm not necessarily going to see all of the return. That the return might benefit other people more than myself. But that's helping the soil for other people and helping the soil for myself to recognize the bounty that then can be given away. The bounty isn't always for yourself. The bounty needs to be for others as much as yourself. That is something that the Spirit puts within us that helps us continue way beyond whatever this flesh may do. That we're setting our minds on spiritual things and not human things. That we aren't getting caught up in my starvation and hunger right now. that we're recognizing the gift of what has been given to me in front of me and making the most of that gift to benefit all of us. We have to, as a world, be willing to take that risk to better take care of our planet. The science shows us time and time again, this is a thing that needs to be taken care of. And the thing that's hard for us is that we need to adapt. We need to change. We have to look beyond quarterly reports, annual reports, 7-year investment returns. We need to be looking 50, 100-year returns. That's what we're looking at. And when we look that way, it becomes a lot easier to say, yeah, that makes sense to do, because the return becomes evident. If we're doing that type of thing within our faith, the return becomes evident. We start looking for things that are beyond us, and the return is inevitable. There's a lot of things with this podcast that don't make fiscal sense. There's a lot of things in the amount of time, effort, financially, things that go into this podcast that don't make sense. And when I even look at the back end numbers, like there's been a lot of crazy numbers that have happened this year, but yet it's nothing like life changing for me monetarily. There's very little that comes in, very little. I'll talk about that when we get to 450, but that's not the point. The point for me with this is getting people to be thinking about this in a way to open up their minds, to maybe getting somebody to talk about it, or having pastors or different people in preaching positions preach about this type of thing, or to be able to provide support for the person who is struggling with that faith and science debate. And the times that I know that that's happened made this all worth it. The prayer often for me is, God, do with this what you will. It's not mine, it's yours. And I recognize the gift that this is going to give to me. I look at it as, in certain ways, kind of a diary of myself in certain aspects of my faith being exposed to you week after week, and that future generations and hopefully future kin can look back and listen and hear where I was at spiritually at all these different touch points. And that's a different type of gift than I think I've ever been able to see someone give somebody. It's something that's beyond myself. It's beyond the monetary. It's beyond all that. It's, how is this going to bless other people? And trust me, when I initially started this, there was plenty of things I hoped that it would be. And I've realized that's more and more what I've wanted this to become, is blessings to others. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you see yourself naturally being selfish instead of being a blessing? Where do you see yourself naturally being selfish instead of being a blessing? Because if we work on being that blessing, being that extra bounty, figuring out ways that we can give that extra bounty, we're softening the soil for so many other people and ourselves. And it allows us to grow to that 30 to 60 to 100 fold that we all strive, that we want to be. It helps us to recognize the other ground that is choking us out with weeds, with rocks being thrown on the path. It helps us recognize that. But it means that we have to get to a place of blessing. Sometimes our blessing is monetarily. Sometimes our blessing is in other forms. So we can always be working on that good soil, that soft soil, that soil that is ready for growth. And that seed is sitting there starting to germinate, starting to do things. And that when some of these other gifts come, it supercharges it. It's fertilizer. It helps it grow to the 30 and 60 and 100 fold. That's what we should be striving for. When we look at how we can impact our world, I believe looking into renewable energy is an amazing opportunity, but I think there's many other ways that we have to be thinking that way. We have to get out of this I-centric faith at times and be looking at how can it be more and more and more of an inclusive we. Because then we're figuring out how to soften the path. Then we figure out, how do we pull these thorns? Then we think about, how do we make sure that we give some more nutrients and more soil to that rocky ground? Or we get so that those seeds aren't ever cast there initially. That's what's important. That's what we should be striving for. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.